Hello and welcome. It's 3 o'clock. It is the 10th day of August 2021, and I am your grumpy guide to all things gaming, the OGGM. And today we are talking about my very first experience with Dungeon World. Dungeon World is a game that uses the Powered by the Apocalypse system. As you know, I am a huge fan of the Powered by the Apocalypse 2d6 system. I have always felt that it was just one thing away from being the next big paradigm shift role-playing game. It could have been the next GURPS and really put the gaming world on its head, but there's just something missing. I can't put it into words, but there's just something the Power of the Apocalypse needs that it doesn't have yet to just make that jump and crash the glass ceiling. So Dungeon World is an attempt to use the Power by the Apocalypse system, which is a 2d6 system, to emulate pretty much 3rd-ish edition, 4th-ish edition, maybe current OSR, D&D. I only say 3rd, 4th current because it does include the Barbarian class, which is more, 3rd-ish edition. And it does include other races besides the classic 4, human, elf, dwarf, halfling. It does include, other things like tieflings and stuff like that. So it's definitely more of an emulation of at least 3rd edition. It was created, of course, by Adam Koebel. We know there's a lot of controversy surrounding that individual, but we won't get into that in this vlog. Instead, we're just going to talk about my first impressions playing Dungeon World for the first time. Now, unfortunately, I played it over Discord, so already there is that. And it feels like it's a game that needs to be played with everybody around the table, especially since there's so much player interaction with the system, and just Discord just doesn't feel like it was the right place to do it. Computers and second generation of hearing the sound and what people say and what the computer hears them say and what you then say, and just the way Discord works, just the way my brain works, that was an issue. That aside, for a campaign, I think Dungeon World would work in a lot of ways. I don't know if it's the best way to emulate D&D. Had they just done a fantasy emulation using Dungeon World and not tried so hard to make a D&D, there might have been some things about it that were better, but generally it sort of captures Dungeons and Dragons, but also opens it up to new interpretations. Now, a huge part of the Powered by the Apocalypse, especially in relations to Dungeon World, is the question and answer, where you approach the DM and say, this is my character concept, and he starts asking you questions. Where is that character from? What did he do? What is he like? Who does he know? And that can take, if you're, even when we dealing with like 3-4 players, much less 7-8 players, that's an hour to 2 hours of just that question and answer. Now, that should only happen in the very first session of Dungeon World, obviously. And if you're running a campaign of Dungeon World, then the question and answer session would be the session 0 of the game, and you wouldn't do any playing. And it would have obviously entrenched the character deeply in the lore of the world, because the character has a say in the building of the world via that question and answer, via that yes, but, via that tell me about your dwarf, tell me about the elves in this world, tell me about that city. You actually have a say in the building of the world, and that's a very living, breathing, intense experience to know that your words actually mattered, and the DM is creating the world based around the way you see the world through your character's eyes. But for a one shot, well, that was almost 2 hours wasted of a game that was only about 3-4 hours. So for a one shot, maybe it should have been pre-generated characters and a lot less time developing that. Still, that developing is really important, and that at its core, that's the heart and soul of Dungeon World, and that's the heart and soul of Powered by the Apocalypse, and it's something that's really interesting, that question and answer section. So definitely a huge fan of that. The emulation of the classes was kind of weird. trying to fit the very broad strokes that is Powered by the Apocalypse into the very defined narrative that is Dungeons and Dragons races and classes. Doesn't really feel like a good fit. I've looked at other Powered by the Apocalypse games, and I've played one other game, and it does work, the moves and the ideas and the sort of more open-endedness of the characters. But D&D is a very definitive mindset and rule set. And if you look at this and then you're trying to run a D&D character doing D&D things in a system that is not designed to do D&D things, it sort of becomes an impairment. Trying to interpret the moves and the bonds and everything, which is another big, the whole idea of bonds and how your party is interconnected. And that's another huge aspect to Dungeon World, which is, again, great. And it's another huge aspect to Powered by the Apocalypse, which, again, is great because it gives you connection to the characters and the other at the table. But, again, it's a time waste if it's only one shot. And it doesn't really fit into the sort of cookie-cutter mentality that goes along with Dungeons & Dragons. Because Dungeon World, Powered by the Apocalypse, forces you to think outside the box, forces you to come up with, different ways to solve the questions because it is so open-ended. The description of the abilities, the description of the powers, the description of the racial abilities, the description of the moves, we'll get into that in a second, much more open to interpretation. Two people could have the exact same move and interpret it two differently, completely ways. And the DM is always responding to what you say, and the world responds to what the characters do with moves and with the actions of the world and the actions of the inhabitants of the world. Which means we have to describe what a move is. And a move is basically, in Powered by the Apocalypse Dungeon World, anything your character does that may require dice rolling. So from simple things like, I hit a guy, well, that's a move. And in the Powered by the Apocalypse Dungeon World, certain things happen when you do that. Casting a spell, that's a move. And again, once the dice are involved, things happen. Now, the dice system in Dungeon World Powered by the Apocalypse is very interesting. It's a 2d6 system, but double sixes I don't think really mean anything because I got a double six and nothing extraordinary happened. I didn't, Double ones, though, do mean something because bad things can happen if you roll double ones. Successes in the game are based upon 10 or higher is a success. 7 to 10 is a success, but something else happens. And below 7 is a fail. But if you fail, or maybe it's below 6, but if you fail, that's when you get experience. So that's also weird. Every time you fail that dice roll, if you roll a 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, you get an experience points because I guess the system says you learn from failing. But I noticed that with my character that I was playing the other night, I was getting very lucky, and I only made like 2 rolls that were below that number limit, which meant in the physics of Dungeon World, I was not getting any experience while the people who were failing were. So that's weird. I guess I can understand the mentality of you learn through your failures, but in a combat-oriented system like Dungeons and Dragons, where my character is trying to hit something almost every action, because I was running a very gung-ho dwarven fighter, and I was having a really amazing dice luck, considering it's 2d6. I wasn't getting any of the experience because I rarely, if ever, failed. Which that's a weird, but then you get later experience from doing other stuff at the end of the game. But that part might work in other Powered by the Apocalypse games, but the whole, well, I rolled a hit and I hit, I don't get any experience. He rolls to hit, he misses, so he got experience. That feels weird and counterintuitive to the thinking of Dungeons and Dragons. The big fault here is Dungeon World is trying to emulate Dungeons and Dragons using the Powered by the Apocalypse system. I mean, it uses armor class, hit points, strength, dex, con, intelligence, wisdom. It uses the classes, it uses the races, it uses the whole D&D mindset, but it's using a completely alien system to D&D to its detriment. Now, I'm pretty sure just a fantasy game that didn't try and fall into the tropes of D&D using Powered by the Apocalypse would probably be amazing. They're using a version of Powered by the Apocalypse for the new Avatar: The Last Airbender role-playing game, and that has just shattered all previous RPG records for role-playing games on Kickstarter. So obviously it does work, just not for D&D. Another issue I had was with initiative. Like, I never was really sure where I was going. The DM said there is no initiative, there is no turns, you just try to do things, which, being that I was running a very gung-ho fighter who was trying to keep all the other characters alive, I was doing a lot of stuff. But then there was times like, okay, is it my turn or not? Because I just said I was trying to do something, and now it's not doing it. And in relation to that, that is where the idea of the moves feels constrained and the bonds feels constrained. Because I very much wanted a bond that my character was very protective of children. And I couldn't have that. According to the rules, your bonds can only be amongst other characters. So one of my bonds was very protective of, and I said I wanted to be very protective of children. Because I'm good, and good characters defend the weak, and good characters defend children. But I couldn't have that. I could only be very protective of another character in the group. Which would have been great if there was like 4 or 5 or 6 of us, but since there was so few of us, it was like, that doesn't really work, and that's not really, okay, fine. And the moves, and also just sort of felt like, okay, when I roll this, these are my only options, and then I just interpret it to the theater of the mind. What if I want to do something different? I mean, it's not really in the description of the ability, so I'm going to just try that and see if the DM lets me do it, and I'm just not going to pay attention to what this says, because this is what I see my character doing in my mind, so that's what I'm going to do. And if the DM lets me, great. If the DM doesn't let me because it isn't in the description of the move, all right. Now, I will say in the DM's defense, he was very good about telling us what moves and letting us describe the successes and the failures. So, like, when my character was going down a ladder and he had to roll a defy danger to avoid the crossbows that were being shot at him while he was going down the ladder. Now, I made one of those yes, but rolls where I avoided the danger, but something bad happens. But instead of telling me what happened, he said, these are your choices. Which one of those do you choose? So that allowed me to continue the story, which I really like. So I chose, I falter. I fall off the ladder and hit the ground, tea kettle up, trying to avoid the arrows. And he's like, yes, you do that. The arrow bangs into your shield, but in order to bring your shield up, you have to let go and you fall, whack, whatever. So, that was awesome. The ability to direct my camera was awesome. The ability to not be told what I'm doing, but instead saying, this is what I'm doing, and the DM saying, okay, roll. But again, there were times when the initiative got just lost, and I didn't know what was going on. And there was like 20 minutes when I was on the phone, which is not, the DM's fault. But then I came up and I was like, what happened? And they're just like, oh, but that's not actually, that's stupid. Ignore that part. Initiative is weird. The system is interesting. The 2d6, the success, but fail, but, or just utter failure. But if there's going to be a dice roll utter failure, then there should be a dice roll utter success 2d6. If I roll double sixes, I should get something, because if I roll double ones, I should lose something. Other than that, mainly the issue is, I think, Powered by the Apocalypse, going back to my original thought, is an amazing system with the right DM, but it's just missing something to truly shatter the glass ceiling. But everything about Powered by the Apocalypse that I got to do last night was fun. I just don't know if Powered by the Apocalypse works to tell Dungeons and Dragons stories. That's not to say you can't tell fantasy with Powered by the Apocalypse, because obviously you can, just not D&D. Now, if you take away the D&D tropes, if you try and make it something completely different, unique to Powered by the Apocalypse, then yeah, 100%. As it is, Dungeon World, and obviously I need to play it some more. And obviously the Discord was an issue. And obviously that means, the Fog of War, the initiative things, that's more on Discord than anything else. And more on just players and DMs not being, familiar with each other and not really understanding I'm yelling over him. Does that mean I get to go? Oh, I want to do this. Can I do this? Is it my turn? Is it not my turn? Are there turns? That I'm sure will be ironed out if we ever play it again. It definitely is a game that needs to be played as a campaign. It doesn't really work for one-shots when you're wasting 2 hours designing the way the stories of each individual character interact each other. That said, the designing the stories of the way each individual character interacts with each other is absolutely amazing, and definitely is the heart and soul of Powered by the Apocalypse, and definitely is something that needs to be thought about and adapted to other games. Maybe not in 2 hours worth, but that's what Session 0 is for. I think I've repeated myself enough, and I will definitely, hopefully, be playing Dungeon World again, so I will have a better insight into the system, minus my own personal failings and just not being very good at games. If you appreciate this content and want to see more, please take a moment to subscribe and help me hit 1,000 subs by 2024. Yes, I did not go into the whole Adam Coble thing. I know he is a creator of this project, and I know there is a lot of controversy surrounding that individual who I have talked about before, but that's not part of this. But it's not to say I won't do it again. Till next time, I'm your grumpy guide to all things gaming. If you appreciate this mental meandering, let me know. Till next time, Dungeon World.